So when you're on a subway ad, you have arrived. Well, another thing to be arriving at is what is the sentiment among advertisers and agencies around podcasting? So when Randall had the great idea to do this first one in September of 2015, we fielded a study with advertiser perceptions. And as you may or may not know, what they do is they talk to agencies and advertisers and ask them, what are you going to spend your money on? And they ask a very specific question back in September of 2015. How likely are you to actually advertise in podcasting in the next 6 months? And the answer in September of 2015, right when this very first event was occurring, was 10%. So 1 out of 10 said they were actually going to advertise in the next 6 months. We've been repeating that study with our friends from Advertiser Perceptions, and the most recent reading is 27%. So it's tripled. So you're on the subway, and you're on the minds of America's marketers and brands, so you have arrived. So what we wanted to do today was get a better understanding of the media habits and attitudes of podcast listeners with a particular focus on advertising, why we're all here today. So to do that, we partnered with Maru Matchbox and Vision Critical, nationally recognized leaders in consumer research, and we focused on frequent podcast consumers, and that's defined as consumers that have listened in the past week. That represents about 15% of all Americans. Well, what we found is podcast fans are tech junkies. Earlier today, we talked about Amazon Alexa. 7% of Americans have one of those devices. Among weekly podcast listeners, 22% have an Amazon Alexa. So that's basically triple the US average. Among weekly listeners, we found the heavy consumers are the 1/3 of the people that do 2/3 of the tuning. And as a percentage of all Americans, that represents 5% of the total US. Podcast consumers are voracious consumers of media, especially streaming media, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Netflix. So our study had 4 key findings. We were just talking about speed listening. And one of the questions we wanted to understand is how much of a thing is speed listening? Well, it's a thing. Speed listening is when consumers speed up the podcast to listen in a shorter period of time. 17% of weekly podcast listeners say they frequently listen. So content and ads are getting sped up. Should ads be read slower, so that they can be picked up in double speed? Well, it's less than 1 out of 5 weekly consumers. So this is not a universal behavior, but something that definitely the industry needs to keep an eye on. Overall, how do customers feel about podcast ads? Well, in short, our second key finding is that listeners love the ads. Listeners say the ads are memorable, engaging, and relevant. And they're very likely to say they would go out of their way to support brands that advertise on their favorite podcasts. The more people listen, the higher the love for the ads. In the history of media, we don't often find such high appreciation of advertising. But love for podcast content translates into love for the ads. And that brings us to finding number 3. We asked how many ads and how many commercial pods listeners would like in a podcast. The conclusion? Podcasting is under-commercialized. Weekly podcast listeners say there's an opportunity for podcasts to have more commercials. And what about the number of ad breaks in the podcast? Well, the longer the podcast, the more ad breaks listeners are comfortable with. About 40% say if there was a 60-minute podcast with 6 ads, they'd be okay with 3 or more commercial breaks. And they don't all have to be voice reads either. Heavy podcast listeners are actually more accepting of pre-produced ads. Now, do not be concerned. We're not saying that consumers are okay with 14 minutes of ads just like you might see on a cable TV network. Podcasting will still be hugely uncluttered, even with the addition of a couple of ads and a couple breaks in longer shows. But there's a bigger story going on here. Ads are not clutter to podcast fans. So does this deep translation for podcast content translate into the potential for a podcast subscription model? That takes us to finding number 4. We asked listeners if they would be willing to pay for an ad-free version of their favorite podcast. Half of the weekly listeners said yes, and the price tag was $5. Now, the heavy podcast listeners actually were more intrigued with the subscription notion. 68% said they'd pay, and they'd actually pay more. So podcast content is valuable, and podcast consumers know it too. So, in summary, speed listening is a thing, but a small thing, something to keep an eye on. Weekly podcast listeners love the ads, and they're actually okay with a few more. And there's also potential for a paid ad-free podcast subscription model. So these highlights and a lot more can be found in Westwood One's podcast download report. It's a 30-slide deck. All of the full findings are available on our website, westwood1.com. I thank you so very much.